is mute. Okay. Maddie, there we go. All right. Just some legal stuff, disclaimers, copyright, risks, me, my bio. So we're going to be talking about the field of traumatic pathological love relationships. And I think what's important about this is that I think there's sort of been an assumption among therapists that this is like pretty new. We're still winging it. We're feeling our way through it. But actually, narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, while, it sounds like it has been a hot topic over the last decade or so, to which I say, yay. The grassroots movement of this has been by the survivors who have gone to the internet and raising awareness over the last decade, which makes it seem as if this is, a new understanding. The rising awareness is definitely new, but the understanding of its theory and the work with survivors is actually decades old, and which you might be surprised to know that it's not real new, and that it contains over 50,000 agency hours in treatment in raw data collection, a relational dynamics theory, trauma survey, an atypical trauma survey, collegiate research on the survivor's personality and profile that we did with Purdue, an evidence-based trauma-informed model of care approach that we teach therapists, and coming soon, a certification program. So all of that, means we have a good base from which we have been building a viable genre of counseling. And there's lots of organizations that have already, started being trained in the PLR theory. And I don't really mean starting, because we've been trained therapists for 14 years, but the US Army, psychologists, the state of Georgia Family Violence Council, various domestic violence organizations, even psychology courses, a documentary we did on psychopaths through the National Geographic Channel. And so while our book, which was a seminal book, the white one in the center there, Women Who Love Psychopaths. So while our book on this topic only came out in 2008, although we had been doing work and research with it, if you Google narcissistic abuse, you will now find over 11 million Google results. So it is definitely coming into the mainstream. So understanding and identifying pathological love relationships, we abbreviate that PLRs, is what we think a missing link in prevention, intervention, treatment, and even research. And so, the obvious question then is, then why do we miss seeing such glaring danger? And so we're going to talk about some bigger reasons, sort of societal reasons. And then we're going to get down to the personal, the top 3 reasons that we miss it as therapists that have been told to us through a study of the survivors. But on a bigger note, on a bigger sort of a societal view of this, we have a long history of avoiding differentiating the dysfunctional versus the pathological. And that's unfortunate, because pathology has highly elevated, what we call the 3 Rs, the risk, recidivism, and also aspects of the relationship dynamics. There's elevated sadism and fatality and elevated resulting severity of trauma and even atypical trauma. So I think all of us who have, worked in for instance, relational violence field, I think we're all sort of clued up that all abusers are not created equal, and that the risk factor is personality pathology and the resulting impulse control problems that go with that. And the rising awareness of those facts is often called what we call pathological love relationships. That's the clinical name. But you probably hear it in pop psychology terminology called narcissistic and psychopathic abuse or toxic relationships. And so this emerging field of PLRs, focuses on some pretty important things. But if you have been out on the internet, cruising around and reading websites and blogs, you might have come away with the impression that this is based on some pretty simplistic approaches. At least that's what I've read, that it makes it seem like you go no contact and you do a couple of other things. But this emerging field, the clinical part of it focuses on evidence-based information, research, personality studies, DSM, criteria, and what we call the 4 key identifiers of pathological relationships. And that's what we teach in our other workshops, is the how to identify these relationships. But the field also focuses on personality, maladaptations, and 4 core impairments that results in interpersonal harm to others, what that harm is, psychopathology and personality science and research on what we call the danger zone personalities. Clinical and evidence-based research on the resulting trauma to survivors, such as the unique trauma and recovery needs of this population compared to other populations and why it's unique. So I think you can see that this is not just about perhaps some of the stuff you have seen online that makes it seem like it's not a detailed clinical field. So it is a field related to the highest end of the danger spectrum and focuses on the elevated danger and the resulting trauma related to a spectrum of disorders that are noted for their low conscience related behavior. And we refer to that spectrum of disorders as the danger zone personalities. So the concept of these danger zone personalities and risks are established from multiple clinical sources. We didn't pull it out of our ear. We're not making it up. It comes from the DSM and the personality maladaptations that is in the back part of the DSM and the alt model of PDs. It's taken from research on interpersonal violence, recidivism, fatalities. It's captured in psychopathology and personality disorder science. It's measured in psychopathology personality assessments and supported by institutionalized data on crimes, recidivism, diagnosis, and risk. And so what we consider to be in that danger zone is narcissism antisocial, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And I'm only going to say that word once because that's a tongue twister. We call them mocks. But that is the danger zone of relational inevitable harm. It's why the title of our psychopaths book, the subtitle says relationships of inevitable harm. So for this brief presentation, we're not gonna, get into the debates about the terminology and categorization of overlaps. There's debate among narcissism and malignant narcissism and antisocial versus antisocial sociopath, psychopath, or psychopath, and Machiavellianism. We just simply acknowledge that any and all of those are within the danger range of personality pathology and risks. So, so a couple of things about PDs and why this is important, why it is important to differentiate between the merely dysfunctional and the truly pathological. And so this information comes from personality disorder expert, Dr. Greg Lester, who teaches the personality disorder certification program for PESI. And he worked on the DSM, his agency was involved with the DSM revisions in personality disorders. So according to him, they are, the reason we do need to differentiate, they are strongly related to a person's quality of life more than any axis one or any other factor ever studied. There is a perfect linear correlation between the overall number of personality disorder criteria that they meet and their quality of life. So the more traits of PDs, the worse the quality of life. And it results in substantial life problems. That's why this field exists about PLRs. We are part of helping survivors based on the pathological partner's substantial life problems. So there's elevated risks seen in increased rates of homicide and suicide, domestic violence, child abuse, high-risk health behaviors, relationship and family problems, hence pathological relationships. That's part of where we fit in. Addictions, organic dysfunction, high consumption of care resources, and yet frequently treatment non-compliant. And so I think we don't always recognize the prevalence of PDs, which I think if we did, we would focus more on that in terms of relational dynamics and relational violence. 1 in 5 have a PD. That's not just cluster B, but A, B, or C. And 1 in 100 have some form of low or no conscience. If this is so prevalent, then why has it been so generalized?